Okay, so this week we're talking about development. Um, so, development is a term that in economics has a specific meaning, and it's the concept of moving countries from being lower income, less economically productive, to more productive. And also includes a lot of what we call socio-demographic features. So features that focus on the people. So the people, demography, studying how they're doing basically. So it's not just about economics, it's also about the wellness of people. And then more recently, development has also included the concept of sustainable development. So um, developing a country without destroying the environment essentially. I want you guys to focus on how particular countries and regions rank in terms of the Human Development Index, which right now is the most well regarded, most well known measurement of development created by the United Nations. Also, look at geographic trends. So, when you look at a map of development, which regions are there patterns in regions that seem to be doing better and worse? And then we're going to look at some critiques of the concept of development in terms of, again, looking at how development might be bad for the physical environment, for, water and, rivers and forests and things like that. And also critiques about how it doesn't take into place women's roles. So in some countries, they might be high on the development index, but women aren't doing as well. And then also in terms of income inequality. So in some countries where some very wealthy people or some very key industries like oil make them rank higher on the development index, but very many other people in the country don't have access to that money. So Saudi Arabia comes to mind. So before we get into that, a few other things. This summer I'm teaching a physical geography course, online of course, and it's on it's physical geography. We're going to study things like fossils, weather and climate, etc. Even the labs will be online. So if you need a lab credit, definitely sign up for Geography 104 with Becky Burnett. Okay, your next quiz is a week from today, so that's April 21st. It's going to be all multiple choice, and it will be open book, or open internet. And here are the things that you'll need to know. I can post that pretty soon this week if you want to get out of the way. Also, I'm grading your presentations on urban issues. I'll try to get those graded ASAP, but they're looking excellent. All right, so if you feel comfortable with the lecture, you can kind of stop here. Otherwise, let's just go over a couple of these slides in more detail because economic development is a little bit more complicated, and I think it's probably better if I do some of the explaining as you go through the slides. All right, so it used to be, and I'm going to let you guys kind of read through these things, but development, it's a process, and you're trying to improve the health, prosperity, so income, and material conditions of people. So by material, we mean physical conditions of people. Things like being able to own a computer or a cell phone, have access to clean water, things like that. And then we do this through the diffusion or the spread of knowledge and technology. It used to be the world was kind of just divided into the developed world and the underdeveloped world. This is also where academics get the term global north, meaning the wealthy countries, and global south, meaning more poor countries. But if you think about it, there's a lot of problems with this methodology because, first of all, it's in terms of global north, global south, you have Australia and New Zealand who are wealthy countries, but also just deciding you're one or the other, there are lots of countries in between. There are countries, and also it gives the idea with developed, ED, it means like you're done developing. You have done everything you can. And we all know every country can constantly improve. And then there's, again, just tons of countries like China and India that show some signs of development, but then in other places like rural poverty, they're not doing well. So then they kind of changed it in the 60s and 70s and 80s, well, more like the 70s and 80s, actually, my bad, to instead of developed or underdeveloped, more developed country, or what's called an MDC. And I want you guys to think about some examples of those countries that are just doing really well, that rank really high. If you were thinking things like the US, Canada, Micah, and Germany, you are correct, absolutely. And then we have the lesser developed countries, or LDCs. So think about countries that you would imagine would rank very low, pardon me, in terms of human development. So a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, war-torn countries like Afghanistan, those would fit that bill. But then there are a lot of countries in between. So they're sometimes called transitioning economies, or BRIC nations. So each of the letters, BRIC, stands for one of the countries that's considered a BRIC. So Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These are countries that illustrate some aspects of development. So, for example, all four of the BRIC nations have strong economic growth most of the time, but countries like China and Russia have authoritarian governments, so people do not have open access to knowledge, so that makes them not as highly developed. Other countries like Brazil are doing well, better, but they have economic ups and downs, so they're not stable. And then India has issues with huge, like if you live in the city, you might have access to a very cosmopolitan lifestyle if you're wealthy and live in the city. And then in rural areas, it's very underdeveloped. Another acronym, so acronym, each letter means something, MINTS. So Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, also examples of countries that kind of fall in between developed and underdeveloped. Then some other terms that come up, the OECD. So the OECD is a group of, so it was founded, I want to say 1961. Yeah, they're early 60s, and it's the Organization for Cooperation and Development. There's 31 countries, and it's generally countries that are not just doing well economically, but also they're all playing in the same sandbox. They're all capitalist, free market countries. So they all kind of, don't utilize tariffs. They really want open trade, and then less investment in the private sector in terms of education, things like that. Another term that you'll see in the news and stuff is G8 or G20. It just means group of eight, and those are the wealthiest countries in the world, kind of the biggest economic power players that are also pretty capitalist. So Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the US, the United Kingdom, the EU. Russia was in, and then they got kicked out and sanctioned as of 2014. And then G20 includes all the biggest economies plus some of these transitioning economies above. But if you're Cuba, if you're a country that leans more socialist, you may not make this list because you have to be, playing the capitalism game. All right. So this is kind of a better way of measuring development. Instead of just 2, there's now 5. So we have high income OECD. So again, countries that are very capitalism friendly, market friendly. So we see all of Western Europe, North America, Australia. Oh, I cut off New Zealand. New Zealand should be here and they deserve respect. Japan, South Korea over here. So East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, and North America are always going to be high income high on development lists. And then you have the countries that are doing well but not part of the OECD. So this is Oman, Saudi Arabia, we have Russia. And then upper middle income. So we have a lot more diversity since the 1960s, when, we'll talk about this later, but was really a turning point when people started to focus on improving or developing countries, getting people out of poverty. So now we have a whole lot more diversity in terms of where countries rank in terms of their development. So this is upper middle income. We've got China, some of what I call Iran is in the mix. Eastern European countries are showing up here. Northern African and Southern African nations are doing, so yeah, you can't just say all of Africa is poor, because it's not. And a lot of South America as well, and then Mexico is there too, and some of these Caribbean countries. Then lower middle income, we start to see more South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then low income primarily are in Sub-Saharan Africa, or countries that have experienced war. So here's Afghanistan, Myanmar, Laos. All right, so just make sure by the end of this class, it would make me very happy if somebody asked you what are some highly developed regions of the world, you can just easily name that. All right, so how do we rank them? Oh, hang on, my bad. The Human Development Index, created in 1980 by the United Nations, and so an index rates things. And then you have indicators. I'm going to use the term indicators. Indicators are the way that you measure and make the ranking. So a decent standard of living, so think of that as economics, a long and healthy life, so that's more of a socio-demographic indicator because you're talking about people, and access to knowledge, another socio-demographic indicator. Highest is 100%. The closest would be some of the Nordic countries. Very highly developed is 0.79 or higher, so 79% or higher. Japan is an example, Norway is an example. And then lower developing is 0.52 or lower, so Pakistan. Take a moment, watch this video from Bill Gates from Microsoft, and he explains how global aid, so things, he's obviously tweeting the Gates Foundation, his own foundation, but how global aid has improved childhood health and development and led to some of the changes like we saw here, from having a lot of poor countries and a few rich countries to a more diverse globe where more countries are doing better, especially in terms of kids living longer. All right. So when you're done watching that video, this is the Human Development Index here. And this is just a splattering of countries, different countries and how they rank. And then over here, we have this GDP, gross domestic product per person. So, or what we'll call later per capita. So this is 53,400, 34,900. The United States, 45,600. So it's not apples to apples, but you can kind of think of that sort of like a median income. So if the median income of a place is 45,000, that's not bad. Now, if it's $600, that's not great. So ranked number 1 is Norway, then Australia, 4th is Canada, Netherlands is 6th, and so on. And then you go down China. So there's about 193 countries in the world. We learned that with political geography 2 weeks ago. So China's about at the halfway mark. India is further behind, and then Niger in Africa is one of the lowest ranked. Go ahead and go over these on your own, and then also watch this video about the United Nations Human Development Goals. So part of the reason of having a Human Development Index, or ranking or measuring anything, is that we want to do better. We want to improve the quality of life for people on the planet. Well, not everyone does, but most scholars do, for sure. Most people do. Anyway, so they take it, they look at the different, who ranks where in development, and then they say, let's make some goals. Let's try to reduce poverty by half. There's a lot going on in this graph, but essentially it's the Millennium Goals and then whether or not they succeeded. So if they succeeded at the goal, it's a Y, yes. If they didn't, it's a N, no. Let's move this real fast. Let me get you out of there. Okay, so the 2015 Millennium Development Goals were develop a global partnership for development, so get everybody on board, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, so make sure kids are literate, that everybody, boys, girls, can afford to go to school, because we've talked about this before, but in a lot of countries, you have to pay for primary education, and if you're already pretty poor, you can't really afford to send your kids to school. Another one was promote gender equality and empower women. Reduce child mortality, so, prevent children from dying at a young age. Important with that, improve maternal health, so the health of pregnant mothers. Combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other chronic or other diseases that are causing lots of death, but in wealthy countries have been malaria has been pretty much eradicated in developing countries, but for HIV, AIDS, we've been able to come up with medicines and things to address it. Newer one is ensure environmental sustainability, and we'll talk about that more later. Usually we kind of think of our history as in the world, at least for the last 200 years, has been one of just constant progress. Like you're going from underdeveloped to developed, and everyone's on a path. But there have been radical increases and decreases. An increase can be something like when China opened itself up to the wider economy and more wealth came in, and that wealth was spread around, leading to a global middle class. Um, but think about why might a country lower its human development? So what might cause a country to um, rank higher one year and then a few years later rank lower? So here are some countries that whose development scores have lowered in the last, what is that, 45 years. And war is a huge thing. War, HIV/AIDS, those are common ones that will lower development index. All right. This just kind of goes in a little more detail. So the dimensions are long and healthy life, access to knowledge, a decent standard of living. The indicators are how you indicate it. So life expectancy at birth, expected years of schooling, mean years of schooling, so average kind of, and then GNI, per capita PPP. And then index just means a way of ranking or measuring. All right, so this is kind of on your own slide. So take notes of economic, environmental, and socio-demographic indicators, and then we'll also go over these in the next couple slides. All right. So know the difference between the gross national income and gross domestic product. I mean, it's not something you need to know for geography. I sometimes have to look it up if I don't think about it for a while. But basically, you're going to have a different picture. So if you're looking in a book and it says GNI versus GDP, one important thing might change how countries rank. So gross national income includes everything. So in the United States, it means companies that are American companies like Walmart, all the stuff they do in China, or all the stuff Nike does in Indonesia, everything counts. All it matters is it an American company or not? And then all the stuff that we're doing, me teaching, you guys going to work, all those are also included. Now, gross domestic, so domestic means home, means only things made in your borders. So all the work that Nike does in Indonesia under gross domestic product will be included under Indonesia's, not ours. Now, per capita is extremely important. Per capita makes it per person. So, like, if you're looking, for example, if you're looking at COVID-19 deaths across the world or cases across the world, it doesn't really help, or it's less helpful to know how many there are as there are per capita, because you want to know, well, how big is the population itself? So if you have a country like China that has a really high gross domestic product, they also have a ton of people that all of that money needs to be spread out over. So if you just look at this giant number and then you look at Ireland or Iceland that have tiny numbers, you might think that those countries are not doing as well economically. No, they're just a smaller country with a smaller population, and when you take all the work that is done, all the product or income, and you divide it over the people, you get a pretty high GDP or GNI per capita because you're dividing it by the people. So, I mean, for example, if we said, how many people in our class of 35, we don't say 35 yet. Hang on, let me slow down. How many people in our class are going to get an A? And it's 20 or 30. People might be like, oh my God, that's not a lot of people getting A's. And then you're like, oh, it's out of 35. Then you're like, oh my God, this class is awesome. They're so smart. So you got to divide it out of the total. And then purchasing power parity, it means basically PPP is a way to measure quality of life across different places. So I've heard people say, well, in Honduras, even, they can survive on $1 a day because everything's so darn cheap there. And whereas in Japan, everything's super expensive. All right, so if you do purchasing power parity, so equality across purchasing power, it allows you to compare countries, and then you say, like, okay, given rent, buying food, education, all the big necessities, how are people doing? If we were in class, I'd have you guys do an exercise, and I have that available, but we're going to keep going. All right, so those are some of our economic indicators: GNI, GDP, purchasing power parity. 2, the new kid on the block, environmental indicators. So I want you to look in your book, or I know some of you guys don't have the book or we're borrowing it from the library. They emerged pretty recently, and they're focused on you can't just develop and destroy everything in your path for the sake of the economy. You have to also be able to sustainably develop. So develop in a way that allows the next generation and the generation after that and after that, healthy waterways, healthy air, and resources, be it oil or trees. All right. So here's a really cool video about ecotourism and sustainable development. So a way that you can develop a country without necessarily, tearing down the rainforest. All right, socio-demographic indicators. This sometimes trips students up a little bit, but it's very simple. So again, socio, that's people. We're social, usually. Demographic, so graphic. You're studying, you're mapping things out. And then demo are humans. So you're studying people. So you're looking at development, and you're trying to measure how are people doing. So you measure in terms of the economic growth with the economic indicators, the environmental growth. Are you destroying or helping the environment in your growth? And then how are the people actually doing? So I kind of think of it as like the good life. So when we think of a highly developed country, what do the people have access to? What do they have? So things like education that's accessible, that's affordable. Health, all sorts of different indicators of health. Access to information, so you can access information for or against your government. You can, you have access to the internet. You can afford to, have a computer or have access to the internet. So you can make informed decisions. Safety from war, safety from crime. Life expectancy is an important health measure. Infant mortality again. So think of some others as well. Now we're going to look at some slides. And so the rest of the lecture is really just looking at slides and looking at, different patterns for socio-demographic. So life expectancy, and a lot of these things we've talked about because we talked about health. We talked about births, deaths, and migration. And so some of these things are going to be, oh, hi, Tony. Hello, baby. My dog's here. Okay, I need the computer. Okay, I love you. So countries with the highest life expectancy, generally higher developed countries have, oh. Shh, baby. Come on. It's okay. Shut up. All right. So countries that are wealthier have higher life expectancies. So we see ranked number 1, Japan, Switzerland, Singapore. But again, if you just look at the numbers, you see again those same regions that we talked about before. So Western Europe, North America. Notice the United States isn't there. That stinks. Japan, South Korea. Down here we have a little baby Singapore. And then Australia. And there's New Zealand. Here's the same. Oh, actually, I'm skipping that slide. We don't need that one. This is ones that have a huge gender gap in terms of life expectancy. And if you remember from weeks 2 and 3 of the semester, why do women have higher life expectancies than men? We had a great conversation about this. Some of it is war. And that's not to say that war does not impact women. It seriously does. But men are often more likely to die during war in combat than women. It can also be work. So especially in sub-Saharan African countries, men, well, not necessarily just sub-Saharan African countries, India, South Asia, Southeast Asia as well. Men work in harder jobs than women. Not harder jobs, more life-threatening jobs. And then all the other stuff. Women are less likely to use drugs, to smoke cigarettes, to drink a bunch of alcohol, Um, the men. Okay. This is development does not just have to be national, it can also be within countries. So in the United States, average life expectancy at birth, it varies according to where you live, with the American South having lower life expectancy than, say, the Northeast. And when I teach this class, and when you guys think about, like, I've been thinking so much about this class because with COVID-19, what is that going to do to the life expectancy of various countries when because we talked earlier about how life expectancy in the USA has been declining slightly because of the opioid crisis and obesity and suicide. And now we have COVID-19, and a lot of demographers, so people that study people, are expecting our life expectancy to go down again. Woo. Anyway, this is cool for you guys. Mean years of schooling. So that's another. So this is a socio-demographic factor. It's a way of measuring the well-being of a country. An educated populace is a good populace. They're entrepreneurs. They have access to information. They're critical thinkers. So the U.S., our average is 12.9 years. I want you guys to think about how many years of education you had. How many years of education your folks had, your grandparents. My sisters and I are all first-generation college students. Our parents finished high school. I don't think my grandma finished high school. Different days, different time periods. And then also, what's the point of education? We always think of it as a good thing, but why? In terms of development, why is it a good thing? College graduation rates there's 31 OECD countries, and 29 of them. The data's old. I cannot find new graphs to save my soul right now. So, Iceland. Doing great. Where's Germany? There's Germany right through there, the USA. So we're doing pretty good. And you guys are kicking butt on that too. So, all right. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about critiques of development. So one, and this will be on your quiz, Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. So it takes into account inequality, income inequality within a country. So where only a few people have high income college degrees and good health care, it's going to lower your ranking. So if you're a country that has plenty of money, let's say like Saudi Arabia, but you don't spread the wealth and the average person doesn't have access to income, to college degrees, to good health care, then this is a separate ranking that changes the index for inequality. So inequality. I mean, you take a place like New York City, for example. They're going to rank hugely high in terms of quote unquote development. But if you take into account inequality, people that live in the neighborhoods that have industrial pollution that leads to asthma, or you have the super wealthy people, and then you also have people that can barely afford to put food on the table. So this looks at countries in a more, so we say like you paint with a broad brush stroke. So that means you kind of paint over certain factors. This wants to put more of a fine point on it, to delve in and really find out what's going on in a country. Because again, if we learn about inequality, the more we learn about it, the more we can address it, and the more humans can live the good life rather than, say, in temporary housing or be in danger, etc. So here's what it looks like. It's in the US we call the Gini coefficient. I've heard people in Europe call it the Gini coefficient. Either way, basically it's a pretty economic term, but it measures economic inequality. So closer to zero is good in this case. So this is the opposite of the HDI. I don't know why they did that to us, but they switched it around and it's confusing. But you can kind of tell if you start to know where regions are located, what regions are more developed and less, you can kind of just see. So we know Germany and Japan are doing really well in terms of development. You can kind of guess that lower is better. So interestingly, Pakistan, less income inequality. Indonesia, less income inequality. And then you go up to places like Brazil, Nepal, China, and the US, and we have more income inequality. States with the highest level of income inequality, again, putting the U.S. into perspective here. New York State is number 1. Where's number 2? Help me, friends. Number 3 is Louisiana. That always surprises me. Oh, Connecticut's number 2, right? Adjacent to New York. A lot of rich people, but a lot of poor people. Florida, same thing. Louisiana, some very wealthy people, some very impoverished folks. And then we got California over here. Now, a lot of the Western states have less income inequality, and it could be because of income redistribution of wealth. Probably not. It's probably that they just don't have a lot of super wealthy people or super poor people. Another critique of capital D economic development as a project, as improving the lives of people, is that it does not take into account gender and how women are doing. It only focuses on how men are doing. So, almost every single country in the world has gender inequality, but in some countries it's much worse than others. So I want you to think about, what are some examples of inequalities based on gender? It can be things like violence against women, not having access to high-paying jobs. It can be things like not having access to education. And this is why some countries like Brazil, China, and Mexico rank a little lower in terms of development, is because women aren't doing as well as men. So they started another index. So we got the Human Development Index, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, and now we have the Gender Inequality Index. Again, just like with the Inequality Index, the Gender Inequality Index, the greater the inequality, the higher the Gender Inequality Index. So how they rate it? Empowerment, so women in politics, because if women are in politics, they're going to be more likely to not always, but they might focus on women's issues like women's health care, maternal health care, women gain jobs. Another one would be women who have completed high school, women working, and then reproductive health. So can a mother become pregnant, have a safe pregnancy, have a safe birth? Adolescent fertility rate. So are people getting pregnant very young? Why is that problematic? Not necessarily is a problem per se, but do they have a choice in the matter of whether or not they're getting pregnant? Are they getting married at a young age? Also, if you have 2 or 3 kids at a young age, it's hard for you to do other things, work in the labor force. It's hard for you to complete high school. And just in general, for having children, people, we really 100 years ago, women died in childbirth in the United States, in Europe, and across the world in droves. We've been able to address that and make pregnancy a much easier, healthier, less dire situation. We need to spread that across the world. All right, so here's our Gender Inequality Index. The higher the rate, the worse the inequality. So we see a lot of countries some countries in the Middle East. Here's Afghanistan. India ranks pretty high there. Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Sub-Saharan Africa. And then countries that have less gender inequality. Again, we see Western Europe, Canada, same-o, Japan, South Korea, and then Australia and New Zealand. And the U.S. is not doing bad. Hey, the U.S. is doing the same as Libya. As Libya and Russia. Oh, sorry, just Libya. Okay, last slide. Another critique is that development sometimes puts profits over people. It says you need to develop, you need to play in the capitalist sandbox, whatever, or you're not doing well as a country. So they're saying it's not entirely beneficial. You lose cultures in terms of development. A lot of the stuff we talked about in the first 2 weeks of class. The environment might get all messed up. So Bhutan, here's a little baby Bhutan, tiny, very impoverished country in the Himalayan mountains. They said Western wealthy countries' ideas of development forgets all the wonderful qualities our country has, like connection with family and a beautiful, beautiful environment. So they came up with the Gross National Happiness Index, and it's so heartwarming. So go ahead and watch this video, and then I want you to think, could this happen in the United States? Could we have our own gross national happiness index? Maybe. Okay, so that's the end of lecture. I'm going to do the same thing, I think, for next week, too. And I'm going to have a guest video of a woman that works in the Kansas City restaurant industry. She's the owner of a restaurant and how it's affecting the restaurant industry. And next week, we're talking about... basically, we're talking about middle class policies, ways to keep a middle class or the good life, keep us developed in the United States. So, all right, if you have questions, please email me. I'd love to hear from any of you guys. Have a great afternoon.